The kitchen faucet coughed once, spat a brown thread of water, and went silent. And Marcus Drane stood with his coffee mug under a dry tap at 6 a.m. and understood that the war had finally started. He did not curse. He did not even set the mug down hard. He had learned a long time ago that the first reaction to a ruined thing is almost always the one that ruins it further. So he set the mug carefully on the counter, walked outside into the cold blue light, and went looking for the reason. He found it at the edge of his property, where the water collector sat against a low wall of river stone. A padlock hung off the manifold like a brass tumor, fat and new, and from it dangled a paper tag in a plastic sleeve. Juniper Mesa, Owners Association. Service suspended. Non-payment. The high desert was already giving off its dawn smell, dust and crushed juniper and cold stone. And the Sangre de Cristo peaks to the east were going the color of the inside of a shell. Marcus, 61 years old and 6 months into what was supposed to be a quiet retirement, took out his phone and photographed the lock, the tag, the manifold, and the dawn light on the dial of his watch so the time would be in the frame. Old habit. A man who had spent 30 years restoring church frescoes and consulting on questioned documents learned to record a thing exactly as he found it before he laid a finger on it, because the touching could destroy the very evidence the documenting preserved. He stood there a while in the cold, breathing, letting the anger pass through him and out the other side, the way you wait for plaster dust to settle before you decide what you're looking at. A car door shut behind him. Gravel crunched. Brenda Ketchell came up the drive in pressed khakis and a quilted vest, a travel mug in one hand, smiling the way certain people smile right before they ruin your morning and want you to know they feel just terrible about it. "Mr. Drane, I hate that it came to this, I really do." She did not look like she hated it. She looked like a woman who had practiced the sentence in the car. "Water's a shared community resource out here on the mesa. You don't pay the association assessment, you don't draw from the system. That's the board's decision. It isn't personal." "I'm not in your association," Marcus said. "I never signed anything. I've never been to a meeting." "Everyone on the mesa is in the association," she said it gently, the way you'd explain rain to a child who'd never seen it. "It runs with the land. Pay the assessment and the late fees, the water comes right back on. $800 even, with the penalties." She was already turning back toward her car, the conversation filed and closed in her mind. "I do hate this part, but the board has to be consistent." Marcus had bought the old Ortiz ranch precisely so that no one would ever again tell him what a board had decided. He had bought it to die slowly and pleasantly across 30 years if he was lucky, restoring the small adobe chapel on its north corner 1 square foot of plaster at a time. And for 6 months, the water had simply worked, the way water works until somebody decides that it shouldn't. He had ignored the first letter, a thing on association letterhead demanding a community water assessment he had never agreed to and could find no basis for. He had ignored the second, which had upgraded its tone to a threat of suspension of services. He had not believed, right up until the faucet went dry in his hand, that a woman in a quilted vest would actually padlock another human being's water in a place where the July afternoons came in at 104 degrees and the nearest open spigot was 40 minutes away. He drove into town that afternoon to the association's office, which turned out to be Brenda Ketchell's 2-car garage, with a folding table set up in the bay where a second car should have been. A laminator sat on a shelf behind her, still warm, and that detail filed itself away in Marcus's mind without his asking it to. She slid a laminated sheet across the table at him like a winning hand laid face up. "This is the water servitude. It was donated to the community 10 years ago by the previous owner of your ranch. Recorded with the county, perfectly legal, signed and witnessed." She tapped the signature line with one manicured nail. "Hector Ortiz. So you see, that water was never really yours to begin with. You bought the dirt. The water belongs to the mesa." Marcus looked at the name and felt nothing in particular yet, because he did not yet know that Hector Ortiz had been 11 years in the ground. He looked instead at the paper itself, because the paper was what he knew, and something at the back of his trained eye snagged like wool on a nail. The sheet was too white, not cream, not the warm ivory that office stock turns as it ages, not foxed at the edges the way 10 years in a county file would leave it. It was white, the aggressive, scrubbed, optical white of paper that had come out of a ream very recently. "I'd like to discuss the legal basis for the assessment," he said evenly, "and I'd like a copy of this to review." "There's nothing to discuss. It's recorded. If you don't like it, you can sue us." Brenda's smile stayed exactly where it was, but Marcus watched her lay her hand flat on the table, fingers spread, the way a person does to stop a tremor before anyone can see it. "The board has been more than patient with you. Don't make this ugly." The county sheriff's deputy he called that evening stood in his dry kitchen, turned the laminated copy over twice under the light, and spread his hands with the helpless courtesy of a man who would rather be anywhere else. "Sir, I hear you, but there's a signed, recorded servitude here with a seal on it. That makes it a civil matter. You'd have to take it up in court." It was the same sentence, Marcus would come to understand over the following weeks, that every system reaches for when it would prefer not to look too closely at what it is holding. So he hauled water. He drove the 40 minutes down to Taos, filled 6 5-gallon jugs at a spigot behind a feed store while a bored teenager watched, and drove them back up the mesa with the jugs sweating in the bed of the truck. He rigged a gravity line from the jugs to the chapel, so he could keep the lime plaster damp while it cured, because the work did not stop just because the water had. And that night, working at his restoration desk by the gooseneck lamp he'd carried through 3 decades in 4 states, he laid the laminated servitude flat on the felt and looked at it the way he'd look at a questioned panel that a museum hoped was a Velázquez and feared was a forgery. He clicked on the small ultraviolet torch he used to read overpainting and old retouching. The whole sheet leapt up at him in a flat, electric, swimming pool blue. Optical brighteners. Fluorescent whitening agents, the additives milled into modern paper to make it read bright white to the eye, and a thing that had not been standard in cheap office and copy stock at the date this document swore it was born. The paper was younger than its own story by years. It was the chemical equivalent of a saint painted in a pigment that hadn't been invented when the altar was built. Marcus sat back in the lamplight and did not feel triumph exactly. He felt the particular cold focus he used to feel the moment a beloved old painting confessed, under his light, to being a lie. He did not sleep much after that. The association's answer to his written questions was not an answer. It was a fine, a formal notice of penalty for non-payment. Then a second fine, this one for unauthorized water consumption, a phrase of real artistry given that the water in question came up out of his own ground through his own casing. Then a letter promising a lien on the ranch itself if the balance went unpaid. The kind of letter designed to make a man with a paid-off property feel the floor tilt under him. And a week after that, a man in a clean polo shirt arrived in an unmarked truck, introduced himself as an inspector, walked the length of Marcus's wellhead with a clipboard and a phone camera, and announced that the well was structurally compromised and a community safety hazard that really ought to be placed under association management for the protection of everyone on the mesa. He photographed everything, declined to leave a card, and drove off before Marcus could get the plate. That was the afternoon Marcus finally opened the thing he had been saving for a quiet day. Weeks earlier, chipping back the failed plaster on the chapel's north wall, his chisel had gone through into a shallow void, and in the void had sat a tin box gone soft brown with age. He had lifted it out, felt the weight of paper inside, and set it on the windowsill the way you set aside a wrapped present. For later, for a day with nothing pressing in it. The quiet day was plainly never coming. So he sat down on an overturned bucket in the cool of the chapel and opened the box. Inside lay a ledger and a bundle of letters tied with waxed string. The ledger was an acequia mayordomo's water book, the meticulous account kept by whoever had once been the elected keeper of the irrigation ditch, the man responsible for who got water and when and how much. The letters were Hector Ortiz's, in a slanting, careful hand. The ledger told its story in columns, and the story had no servitude in it anywhere. For 10 years, the houses up on the mesa had drawn water from the ranch well, and every single entry recorded the draw the same way, as a courtesy, a neighborly loan, agua prestada, water lent, never water owed. There was no deeded easement. There had never been a recorded servitude. There had been a handshake between a developer in a hurry and an old man who trusted his neighbors, and the handshake had died when the hand did. Under the torch, the ledger's iron gall ink fluoresced the correct, dull, honest, near nothing of its true age. When Marcus laid the forged servitude beside it and lit them together, the contrast was a confession. The ledger lay dark and quiet. The servitude blazed blue, and the signature on it glowed a second, sharper way. A modern gel ink pigment sitting up on the surface of brightened modern paper, playing at being 11 years old and failing the test, the way fresh overpaint always fails on a centuries-old face. He needed someone who remembered the water itself, not just the paper. He found her through the Acequia Association 2 valleys over. Dolores Ortiz Baca, 78 years old, the current mayordoma of the ditch, sharp as a chisel and twice as direct. He learned the rest when she opened her door, saw the tin box under his arm, and went still. "That's my father's book," she said quietly. Then Marcus showed her the laminated servitude, and her whole face changed, the way weather changes on the mesa, all at once. "That is my father's name," she said. "That is not my father's hand. I'd know it blind." She set the paper down as if it had a smell. "And my father was in the ground a full year before this meeting they say he stood up at and signed. I buried him myself. I know the date better than I know my own." After that, it stopped being one man's fight. Dolores brought the old people who remembered, men and women who could say, under oath if it came to that, whose well it had always been, and how the water had always been lent and never sold. Through the state engineer's office came Remy Chacon, a young hydrogeologist with mud permanently on his boots, who was already mapping the aquifer under the mesa for the state, and who pulled the official well log, walked the casing himself, and said in the flat voice of a man reading a gauge that the wellhead and the entire producing zone sat squarely and unambiguously inside Marcus's parcel boundary. There was no gray area. The water was his by every measure the state recognized, and in Taos, working out of an office over a saddle shop, a sole practitioner attorney named Hank Abeta, a man who had spent a long career on Spanish land grant and acequia water cases that bigger firms found too strange and too poor to bother with, read the ledger, studied Marcus's ultraviolet photographs for a long, quiet minute, and leaned back until his chair creaked. "They recorded a forged servitude over a dead man's signature to take a man's water," Hank said. "That is not a property dispute, Mr. Drane. That is a quiet title action and a criminal referral, and I would be honored to file both." They sent the association a cease and desist over the shutoff and moved the court for an order to stop the threatened seizure of the well. Discovery cracked the thing wide open, the way a hidden water stain finally cracks the plaster it's been rotting from behind. The subpoena Ducis Tecum went to Mesa Vista Development, the company that had carved the subdivision out of old grant land a decade earlier, and the internal email it dredged up ran in a cold, straight, damning line. When Mesa Vista split the parcels and sold them, it had simply never recorded any water servitude at all. An oversight, a corner cut for speed and money in a hot market, a defect nobody noticed while the checks cleared. The homes had been sold and mortgaged for 10 years on the silent assumption that the water was secure. When Brenda Ketchel, the realtor who had personally sold half of those very houses, had begun to suspect the defect was real, Mesa Vista had not fixed it. They had pointed it at her like a gun. Fabricate the servitude, paper the hole, or every mortgage you closed comes apart and you, personally, get sued into the dirt for the disclosures you signed your name to. She had not invented the scheme. She was its hostage, and she had reached for a dead man's name because she was drowning, and his was the nearest thing to grab. Mesa Vista did not retreat when the suit landed. It countersued Marcus for slander of title and disparagement, sent 3 lawyers up the mesa in 2 leased SUVs, and leaned on one of Dolores's oldest witnesses, a widower in his 80s, until he stopped answering his phone and asked, in a shaking voice, to be left out of it.
And then, on a cold night with the season's first hard frost ghosting white across the windows, Brenda Ketchel knocked on Marcus's door with nothing at all in her hands. "I sold those people their homes," she said. The folding table steel was entirely gone out of her voice. 41 families. I stood in their kitchens and told them it was a good place to raise their kids. If the water title fails, their mortgages are defective, and Mesa Vista made very sure, in writing, that I would be the one left holding every piece of it. She pressed the heel of her hand hard against her mouth and held it there a moment. I told myself a piece of paper would keep the water on for all of them. I knew whose signature it was. I knew the man was dead. I did it anyway. And I've been sick every day since. Marcus made her coffee, because that was the decent thing, and his mother had raised him decent. And he gave her nothing else, because the well was still padlocked, and 41 families did not erase a forged dead man's name. The judge, days later, declined to enjoin the seizure on the strength of the papers alone. Money damages, he observed dryly from the bench, are rarely irreparable, and he would not freeze a party's conduct without both sides before him. He set the matter instead for an expedited preliminary injunction hearing 3 weeks out, which meant the well sat exposed and the lock stayed on while the nights got colder and the stakes climbed higher. The frost was what changed the whole shape of the thing. Remy came up the mesa 2 days later, white-faced, with a printout flapping in his hand. He had run the numbers on what the association actually intended. If they seized the well and ran it under their own community management, it would fall to the same crew of contractors who had let the servitude lapse in the first place and hadn't touched the system since. And the old shared distribution line, never bled, never insulated, never maintained, would not survive a hard freeze. The line would split underground. 41 houses and the ranch alike would lose every drop in the dead heart of a high desert winter, with the repair crews a week out and the temperature in the single digits. The very thing Brenda believed she was protecting, the seizure itself, would destroy. She had reached for the dead man's name to keep the water on, and the scheme that name served would freeze it solid. And the polo shirt inspector who had condemned a sound well, Hank's subpoena tied him to no county or state office anywhere. It tied him to Mesa Vista's own payroll. He was a private appraiser the developer had sent to manufacture a hazard finding on demand, so that Mesa Vista could seize the well, cure the title defect by owning the source outright, and then resell the entire water system to the homeowners as a clean, packaged utility at a markup. He was the rope strung between Brenda and the developer, and the moment Hank had him on paper, the 2 frayed ends pulled tight into a single knot. At the preliminary injunction hearing, the court froze all of it. A lis pendens went on to the phantom servitude.
The seizure stopped cold. The subpoenaed emails put Mesa Vista's instruction to fabricate into the record in the company's own words. In deposition, Brenda Ketchel broke and confirmed the coercion under oath, and the developer's representative drowned, one sentence at a time, in correspondence he plainly hadn't believed would ever see daylight. Remy laid down the well log and the aquifer survey and the frost analysis, all three, and testified that the proposed seizure was not merely fraudulent, but a genuine danger to public health and safety in a freeze. Hank set the total absence of any recorded servitude, anywhere, in any volume of the county records, on the table beside it. Then Marcus stood and did the one thing he had always been able to do better than anyone else in any room. He set up the projector he used for teaching. He laid the forged servitude beside a single open page of the mayordomo's ledger, switched off the courtroom lights, and turned the ultraviolet on them both, and the whole room watched two pieces of paper tell the unvarnished truth about their own ages. The ledger's old iron gall ink lay dark and still and 100 years honest. The servitude flared up electric blue, brightened paper that could not have existed at its claimed date, and the signature on it glowed as exactly what it was: a modern gel pen riding on top of manufactured antiquity, betraying itself the way wet overpaint betrays itself across the cracked face of an old and patient saint. Dolores took the stand, identified her father's true hand from the genuine ledger entries, and then stated, without a tremor, the date carved into his headstone, a full year before the meeting the laminated document swore he had attended and signed. Ink lies under ordinary light. It does not lie under that. The court declared the servitude void from the instant of its filing, quieted title to the water squarely in Marcus's favor, and sent the forgery and the development fraud to the district attorney as a single bound package. The water shutoff was restyled, in the criminal complaint that followed within the month, as the unlawful act it had always quietly been. Mesa Vista's principal was indicted on mail fraud and disclosure counts that had nothing warm in them anywhere, and the polo shirt appraiser, faced with a federal cell, took a plea and testified in detail about exactly who had paid him to condemn a perfectly sound well. Brenda Ketchel, whose own emails proved she had reached for the dead man's name with her eyes wide open, lost her board seat and surrendered her real estate license for good. But because she had been a hammer swung by a heavier hand, the prosecutor allowed her to plead to a charge that kept her out of prison and on a long probation. Marcus did not push for more than that. He had spent his whole working life learning to tell honest restoration from ruin, original from overpaint, the hand that forges from the hand that is forced, and he found he had no appetite for grinding down the second when he had the first dead to rights. Then he did the thing nobody on the Mesa expected. He granted the water's servitude himself, a real one this time, drafted by Hank, recorded with the county, notarized with every living signer present and breathing, so that the Mesa would never again wake up to a dry tap. The 41 houses got their water guaranteed in plain language in the public record. But the well stayed his, and its day-to-day stewardship passed to the acequia under Dolores's care, deliberately out of reach of any board that might someday decide again that a faucet made a convenient weapon. They bled and re-insulated and rebuilt the old distribution line 3 days ahead of the next hard freeze, working in headlamps and breath fog, and when the cold came down, it held, every joint of it, all the way across the Mesa. The association rewrote its bylaws that winter, and for once, nobody fought it. No shutting off water as leverage, ever, for any reason. Every document notarized with the signer alive and present in the room. The mayordoma's eyes on the common intake by standing right. Remy Chacon made senior hydrogeologist at the state office and pretended, badly, that the promotion didn't please him. Hank Abeta picked up more land grant clients than he honestly wanted and complained about the workload with enormous and visible satisfaction. Dolores had her father's name set back onto the brass plate at the wellhead, where someone, years before, had quietly let it weather away to nothing. On the first warm evening of spring, the mesa held a fiesta de agua at the well, a place that had been sour and frightened and locked all winter, and was now again simply a place where clean water came up out of the ground for everybody who needed it. Children ran the irrigation ditches with paper boats. Somebody's brother played a guitar badly and with great feeling.
Marcus finished the chapel that same week, troweling the last skim of lime plaster onto the north wall. All of it but the shallow niche where the tin box had waited out the years in the dark. He left the niche open and set a pane of glass over it, like a tiny reliquary. Inside, under the glass, he laid two things side by side: the laminated forged servitude, electric and dishonest, and a single page of the mayordomo's ledger, in its honest, dark, 100-year-old ink. On a small brass plate beneath them both, he had 4 lines engraved, and Dolores read them aloud at the fiesta in her dry, carrying voice, in the gold last light under the Sangre de Cristo, and then laughed her dry laugh, and the whole mesa raised their cups of their own water and drank to it. Ink lies under ordinary light. It does not lie under this. The well was always ours. Now it is yours too. Marcus Drane won the day he refused to argue with a laminated sheet and chose instead to read it. A lifetime of restoring frescoes and authenticating questioned documents had trained one reflex: record a thing before you touch it, then put the right light on it. And that reflex turned a recorded water servitude into a confession. The paper failed 2 tests no forger had thought to beat. It glowed electric blue under ultraviolet, from optical brighteners that post-dated its own claimed birth, and the man who supposedly signed it had been a year in his grave when the meeting it described allegedly took place. The legal frame around that proof was almost quiet by comparison. A quiet title action to clear the phantom servitude off the record. A preliminary injunction to stop the seizure once the frost made the harm genuinely irreparable. And a mayordomo's century-old ledger that proved the water had always been lent by handshake, never deeded away. What sank the developer was the same thing that exposed the paper. The oldest, honest document in the room outranked the newest, confident one. And Mesa Vista had built a scheme on the bet that nobody would bother to date the ink. The grim joke underneath it all is that a padlock on a tap in the high desert is not leverage. It is evidence, and it keeps perfectly until a hearing. Marcus even left Brenda Ketchel away to stand back up, because he could tell the hand that forges from the hand that is forced. If a stranger in a quilted vest padlocked your only water and slid a legal document across a folding table, would you sue, or would you reach for the ultraviolet light?